As I sat here, I was reading this beautiful banner up here and was relieved when I got to that bottom part that says that this is a welcoming, accepting, diverse, and inquiring spiritual fellowship, which indicated to me that the people who are here are pretty sure that they don't know everything yet, and that we're all on this journey of learning about stuff. And at 75, I know that I have still a ton to learn, and I'm enjoying this part of my life where I get to concentrate on that sort of thing. So anyway, I will begin. I was raised in the United Church of Christ and continued to participate into my adult life, far into my adult life. And in 1997, during our annual budget meeting, it was proposed that the congregation's giving to world missions be reduced by an amount roughly equal to the amount that was going to be added to the budget to hire an additional custodian. I spoke against the proposal, arguing that if we need to address shortcomings in our building's maintenance, we should either volunteer to take care of those things ourselves or provide the needed funds to cover the cost. But we should certainly not ask struggling, starving third world folks to be paying our custodian. The proposal from the budget passed overwhelmingly, and I felt the congregation's actions did not reflect its rhetoric. And at the age of 49, I left my lifelong church. As my wife and I sought a place, a congregation that we felt strove to follow the ways of Jesus, we attended a service where I had a profound spiritual experience that changed my life. It was not the sermon. I have really no idea what that pastor spoke about that morning. But as I left, I was deeply, deeply moved. Soon after attending a few other churches to get an idea of where we were going to land, I was standing after a service at that church looking out the back door or the front door of this little storefront, and I became aware that I had a personal responsibility to share what I have with those who struggle. You'll find it hard to believe, but I wept and knew that I had to act on this epiphany. Because of the nature of institutional churches, this meant that I had a calling and I had to find a slot in which to fit to follow up on this calling. So I sought the counsel of my pastor, our bishop, and various leaders from around the country. By the way, the denomination is the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. The denomination reported in 2022 that they have 36,000 churches, 7 million members in 178 countries. So it's a large Pentecostal evangelical organization, which now sort of frightens me. The prevailing opinion among those people that I sought advice from was that I should pursue education and training to become a pastor, which I did over the next 2 years. Because of my past education and lived experience, the bishop, who had become a personal friend and actually is my son's father-in-law, used his authority to allow me to bypass the usual year of preliminary work before beginning the program. Shortly before I finished, there was a need for a pastor in Iron Mountain, Michigan, and I was offered the opportunity to pastor a very small, struggling congregation there. I was in the midst of my internship at the church in Crandon at the time, and I conducted my first service in Iron Mountain on the Sunday before Christmas of 2001. I remained there for 4 years while at the same time operating our American Plan resort near Rhinelander, which my wife and I had owned and operated since 1981. I had grown up on the resort, having moved there in 1955 when my parents got this crazy idea that they should buy a resort and move north from West Dallas. And we lived there and the resort operated until 1979 through 78, and at which time my parents decided to close it and have it, try to sell it off as condominiums. We ended up actually in the resort business through a series of strange events, including our having moved to Rhinelander after I graduated from Lawrence University in 1971. I taught social studies at the high school, and my parents, having decided to convert the resort, now had a large resort with significant debt from doing the physical and legal conversions to the buildings and preparing it to sell. And then on Halloween of 1980, my father died and collapsed on a main street in Rhinelander. The following spring, I told my principal that I was going to resign from teaching, and we reopened the resort, eventually buying it from my mother. We operated that resort until 2005, so there were 4 years when I was in Iron Mountain during which we did both resorting and commuting to Iron Mountain to lead that congregation. In 2005, as the universe would have it, in November, I received an invitation to preach at a church in Kenosha, which was looking for a pastor, and I accepted the call to preach, to lead that congregation in November of 2005. My time in Kenosha was radically different for me. Our building was shared with a Mexican evangelical denomination who rented it from us, and I became friends with a number of them, including their pastor and the man who cleaned the church after each of their services. I learned a lot about them and a lot about the members of the congregation I served, particularly the prejudice and racism that seems so odd for a collection of people who proclaim Jesus as their guide and model. I was also now in close proximity with fellow Church of God pastors and congregations not far from the bishop's office, and I developed relationships with fellow Pentecostal pastors in the city of Kenosha. In fact, a couple of years after I got there, we formed an informal group that gathered regularly to talk about all sorts of matters as they related to what was considered our common faith. It was through these situations, relationships with the Latinx folks, Pentecostal/evangelical folks, and church leaders, that I increasingly learned both the struggles of Latinx folks and the dark side of institutional evangelicalism in particular, and institutional religion in general. After 4 years, it became clear to me that I did not fit in with this denomination and began planning my retirement and the passing of the church building, the parsonage, and the congregation onto a congregation that needed a home and which more closely reflected my values than those who had been in control of the church prior to my arrival. By the way, I was able to grow that church from about 22 people, it would seat about 250, to about 18 people. That's including the people that came because of me and those who left because of me. But on my last Sunday there, which was a joint service with the the congregation of a pastor that I had met, there were about 100 people in that building on our last Sunday. So I just used kind of a different approach to growing the congregation. So I finished up in Kenosha in 2010 when we moved to Texas. It was the year after I had lost my mother, an older brother-in-law, and my father-in-law. I was retired. We had no family responsibilities in Wisconsin and decided to move to be near our older son and his family with 4 children. We bought a house just outside a very poor, small town about 25 miles east of Dallas on a large reservoir. We soon became part of a small bilingual church with mostly Spanish-speaking folks, most of whom were poor and represented the full spectrum of documentation. Since my wife had been a Spanish teacher for 23 years, she was able to communicate and translated for me, and I soon learned about the living conditions of many of them. I had bought an enclosed trailer and pretty extensive collection of tools, so I began working on people's homes, doing carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, and we used most of our savings buying materials for fixing up the homes. And I spent most of my time working in people's homes during those 4 years prior to our last. In 2015, when our son told us he was going to take a position in St. Louis, we sold our home and bought a small, modest home in a diverse neighborhood in Appleton, where I quickly became involved as an advocate and ally among both the LGBTQ communities and people of color in the city. I married before I had graduated from Lawrence and was married for 52 years. It was 4 days before our 52nd anniversary that we last lived together. And I felt a surprising sense of relief and immediately began to imagine a new, fulfilling life ahead, even at the age of 74. Well, there was surely a great deal of trepidation over how this new reality was going to work, including the process of divorce. It took less than a year to settle it, and I'm happy to say that my life has flourished since then. So now I stand before friends in this place to share with you some of my heart. Now back to the Planned Parenthood thing. Because of my involvement with them, I learned that they prioritize accommodations for people who might not fit all our norms, and with LGBT communities. I have seen that inclusion of pronouns on name tags is routine. My hope is that my wearing pronouns on my name tag, along with my sharing these ideas today, that it might be a model for others to follow. Today I want to make my case for this being normative for the fellowship, as it is with virtually all groups who minister to people who are or may feel uncomfortable or not safe in a social situation that includes sharing names. So as you hopefully continue to listen, you will know that I have a purpose in mind, and that purpose is to encourage all of you to choose to include your preferred pronouns on your name tags as well. Beyond that, my hope is that our time together today will stimulate interest in moving beyond where each of us is right now in our understanding and sense of allyship with the LGBT communities that are all around us. Let me begin with a brief explanation of my title. I was sitting in the waiting room of the clinic where I visit my primary care physician, filling out the required annual update of my personal information. The first item to be filled in was in the upper left corner of page 1. It required me to check one of 2 boxes listed as male or female. The category was listed as sex. I immediately recoiled at that fact and that a medical facility in 2022 would make reference to one's gender as sex, it seemed to me that a medical institution would be much more sensitive to our times by, first of all, terming it appropriately, gender, and secondly, providing an opportunity for someone who doesn't identify specifically as male or female to give what they feel is an accurate response. It is at this point I think it's important for me to tell you that I was an anthropology major at Lawrence with a focus on cultural anthropology. This has proven to be an important factor in my post-money-making years. And with that background, I'm presenting my case today. Our culture has an unhealthy aversion to openly talking about sex, which flows mostly from institutional religion, whose primary source of information is a book authored almost entirely and later interpreted almost entirely by men. These representatives and authorities of patriarchy have had and continue to have an outsized influence on our social mores, especially regarding sexuality. As a result, conversations about sex are avoided and discouraged in wide swaths across our society. Each of us has had our own family or nurturing community in which we learned our values. For many of us, certainly me, talk of sex and sexuality was avoided. This religious turned societal taboo causes many parents to be at least reluctant, if not completely unwilling, to discuss sex with their children. This intentional avoidance in both the home and in most churches results in children and later adults repressing their feelings and avoiding at all costs discussing them with others. Over the years, this has served the normative majority well. No need to talk about uncomfortable things because most of us are what our culture accepts as normal. That's the term, normal. Over the past decades, due, I believe, in great part to the 1969 Stonewall Revolt, and if you don't know about that one, that'd be a good one for you to learn about, recognition of the purposely silenced and purposely hidden struggles of people whose sexuality and gender identity are not what our culture accepts and teaches as normal, has grown. Many of us here today were adults past our formal education by the time these concerns, especially related to trans issues, were more widely addressed. I'm grateful for a fellowship like this one where there is wide acceptance of the reality of diversity, including regarding both sexuality and gender identity. So I believe that I'm standing before the choir, not preaching, but helping to harmonize more effectively. While the difference between sex and gender identity is obvious when we stop to consider each, it is here that we often fail to differentiate. The conflation of the two flows naturally from the grouping together of the two issues into the popular terminology LGBTQ and sometimes plus, reminiscent of how we learned our vowels. The first three letters, L, G, and B, refer to sexual preference, being attracted sexually and/or emotionally to individuals of the same gender. L stands for lesbian, G for gay, and B for bisexual. Let me be clear here, these are not derogatory terms. These are terms that have been accepted by the very communities they reference. The letters T and Q are related to gender identity and are independent of one's sexual preference. Let's first consider the T. The T represents the word trans, which is a shortened form of the word transgender. It is not short for transvestite nor transsexual. Transgender is a word denoting or relating to a person whose identity does not conform to the gender assigned to them at birth, determined by a simple observation of their visible genitalia. In our culture, a baby is registered at birth as either male or female simply through this basic observation. A 6-year-old who was identified by their genitals at birth may be far more comfortable enjoying activities culturally identified with children of the other gender and feel far more comfortable in the company of children who identify with the other primary gender. This obviously doesn't mean that the child wants to have sex with their friends any more than a boy playing Little League means the shortstop wants to have sex with the pitcher. It is our culture's preoccupation with sex that often leads people to have that concern. A person who feels that they're emotionally and physically a gender other than what their genitalia observed at birth indicate in our culture faces scorn, humiliation, and rejection in all areas of their lives. There's a quote in the service guide from the book entitled Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester that was clarified for me by a friend, Red Melzer, who is trans, and in fact is the first openly trans person to ever be elected to public office in the state of Wisconsin. He is an alderperson in Appleton. He explained that acquiescing to, and you might want to look at that quote, acquiescing to majority rule means either being or presenting as a cisgendered heterosexual. And cisgendered refers to one who identifies consistently or consistent with the gender that they were identified with at birth. That is what the term cisgender or cis references. Every trans person fails to acquiesce to the majority rule. People who come out as trans refuse to acquiesce. Those who refuse know that they are not failing. It is the majority rule that is failing them. The principles of the Unitarian Universalists, which Ginny pointed out in the beginning, which guide this congregation, and thus to varying degrees those of us who identify with the fellowship, require actions and adjustments to protect those vulnerable people from both intentional and unintentional actions, traditions, policies, and practices that lead to any sense of there being less than a beautiful, fully accepted person. The Q, representing queer, references folks who typically don't fit either the F or M form, the box on forms that our culture has taught us is a basic identifier of an individual. Some are non-binary, some are fluid, some are something else regarding or relating to gender identity. Again, not sexual preference. It is our culture's insistence that one identify as female or male that makes this matter a source of discomfort for folks who don't have a clear idea of what gender they should claim to be. To such a person, it is very possible that the only time it's an issue is when there are cultural pressures brought on by people with whom they interact, people who insist that their frame of reference apply to all. I assure you, I don't know what that means to a gender non-conforming person. I have no idea what it feels like to identify as something other than a man. Since most people match the norms of society, thus the term normal, cultural norms and social mores are built around us folks. It represents what I termed in my social studies teaching days as the tyranny of the majority. Democracy does not have a heart for minorities of any sort. So we cannot count on the goodwill of the majority to protect those who are different. It is up to us to do so. I want to make my case that a person's sexual preference is not directly related to one's gender identity, and vice versa. They represent two distinct matters, both of which subject a person to being identified as different. The matter of pronouns, then, is a significant matter when interacting with people who do not match the cultural norms relating to gender in one way or another. For us to suggest that pronouns don't matter to us is to exhibit the power or show the power of our culture to determine our values and our thinking. It is a fact, as Vered pointed out to me recently, that we use pronouns far more than names when referring to someone in the second or third person. If remembering and using one's name is important to us, and it obviously is, please consider how important it is to use one's correct pronoun. It is straight, cis folks who believe that choosing one's preferred pronoun is controversial, yet it is gender nonconforming folks who are affected. If that is the case, since we're the ones who insist on the norm of female and male pronouns, it is incumbent upon us to be sensitive to how pronoun misuse and pronoun importance impacts the non-normative person. An example that I believe is an appropriate comparison is the struggle for the legitimacy of the term Ms. as an alternative to Mrs. or Miss. During the 70s, when I was teaching social studies, there were many who argued against the general acceptance of the term for a woman, independent of her marital status. Tradition in Western English-speaking cultures has made a distinction between women who were married and those who were not. One of those arguments was made by folks who insisted that they didn't respond differently to women who were married or single, so they didn't feel that there was a need to add that option. For women for whom being married did not serve as a significant identifier, the traditional terms were actually burdensome, bothersome, and in some cases, oppressive or offensive. Since it is those people who were the subjects referenced by the term, it is they who should be the ones who chose the term they preferred. As we all know, the term, after about 50 years, has become routinely used without debate, or even in most cases, even discussion. Of course, if you visit a conservative church or a conservative political event, you will not see nor hear the term. I didn't choose to have my pronouns included on my name tag because I felt that my gender markers are difficult to discern, but because I want to signal to any visitor that I respect the fact that gender isn't always easy to discern. For a person who may not have physical features, a voice, or mannerisms clearly consistent with one gender, we invite them to let us know their preferred pronouns the same as they are invited to share their names. If a person whose gender preference or identity is not necessarily the same as they were registered at birth visits a group wearing their pronouns as they wear their names, they are more likely to feel safe and welcome. Were we to expect that only trans or other non-conforming people wear their pronouns, it would identify them as the different ones. Again, the principles on which Unitarian Universalism is built dictate that we take every opportunity to move toward a more just, affirming, welcoming fellowship. This is a challenging step for many. For some, it seems unnecessary and troublesome. It is my hope that before anyone in any way dismisses the importance of what I've suggested, that we allow a time of reflection, maybe further study and some pondering before reaching a conclusion on how each of us feels about this matter. I'm not suggesting that the fellowship adopt a policy of including pronouns on name tags. I'm asking each of you individually to consider having your name tags changed to include your pronouns because you feel it's the right thing to do. As we discovered, the cost of new name tags is reasonable, and there is a fund to cover the cost in the event that this is an issue for anyone. I'm grateful to be a part of a fellowship of people devoted to the principles that serve as the basis for this gathering and value the relationships that have developed during my relatively brief period of time with you, and really, really appreciate the opportunity to share with you today.
I think we have some time for questions, comments, and I see Tom has his hand up. And Jim will bring him a microphone.
There are many terms which everyone uses, including those that you used. We have the term norm or normal. I don't know what the origin is. I remember in statistics, that was the average. In other words, we take all of the data and we mix it all together. And that somehow suggests that the majority maybe should decide how all of us should act or behave or think about our relationships to each other. Maybe we have to move away from the idea that some normal is what should be happening. We hear the weatherman say, go back through history, and he says, the weather today should be this because of the normal, and he's suggesting that somehow nature decides what's going to happen based on some kind of rule like that. And I think we need to move away from that idea that there's such a thing as normal and how we should behave.
Thanks, Tom. And one of the things the reason I referenced the anthropology thing is that I studied that sort of thing, the fact that we are the way we are because of the way that we've been raised. And most of those things go unnoticed by us. A fish doesn't notice that it's swimming in water. And sometimes it's difficult for us to accept the fact that we believe the way we believe, not because we've thought through everything from the first step, but there are so many givens where we begin to think, and it's those things that have to be deconstructed, I believe. The walls have to be taken down so that we're not boxed in by the rule that, well, we do what's the normal, and what is the normal, and is the normal decent? So thanks.
Sandy. Oh, or whoever, Patty.
I just want to say that I have 7 grandchildren between the ages of 14 and 20, and they live in all different parts of the country and have attended public school and are very comfortable with the new pronouns and the use of them, and it's our generation that has to change. The younger people are moving forward. And another thing I want to note is when I attended the UUA General Assembly, and it kind of shocked me because I obviously am the older generation, everybody identified themselves by a pronoun. And I found that very interesting and something that I wasn't used to. And I think I have to learn a lot, and I think I speak for many of us of my age group. Thank you.
I think you're right, Sandy, and I've noticed that at business meetings and other types of gatherings that are organized, people are often asked.
I want to thank John for his courage and his willingness to share things that were hard for you. And that makes what you asked us to do all the more credible, because you're not saying this is going to be easy, no problem. It will not be easy, but it's something we need to do, and we need to think seriously about it. We don't have to decide this morning, but it's something we need to think seriously about.
And I want to point out that I don't stand before you as an expert on trans issues or any of the LGBTQ issues, but I do stand before you as a man who has spent the last 8 years of my life deeply embedded as an ally with those communities. And so I'm speaking about allyship rather than about the issue itself.
Okay, I just wanted to say I brought in a book today that people might want to take a look at. It's called Mistakes to Miracles, And it is about 5 UU congregations in the United States that made great efforts to become more diverse. And it talks about the wonderful things that happened and the not so wonderful or difficult things. So it's for the church or congregation.
John, I think I just thought of something that I asked you once some time ago when you talked about, we were visiting the church, the UU Fellowship in Appleton, and you talked about how they might make an effort to become more welcoming to, I think, Latinx people. It was what we were talking about. And you said something like, if I remember correctly, it's not about, making a big statement that you're welcome to them, but it's about making those people, should they show up, feel comfortable. And then word of mouth results in the more diverse gatherings, which makes perfect sense.
Back to what Tom talked about, normal. When you go to a church service, there are pews that you sit in facing the front, someone talks to you, and then you agree or disagree, and then you have some coffee and go home. And typically there are things like music. And like it or not, our music is very white and very European American. So if someone likes a different style of music, they probably need to go somewhere else. This is what we're comfortable with. And this is one of the reasons why I was very unsuccessful in growing a congregation as a pulpit pastor, is that I never think of this as a place to nurture and affirm. That's done one-on-one, I believe. This is a place to challenge and encourage people to grow. And so that's one of the problems with institutional churches is typically they pay a pastor, and as long as that pastor satisfies the congregation, she or he has a job. So too much effort is made making people feel comfortable and not enough time making them feel uncomfortable. And the idea that a church like Appleton, which is pretty successful, pretty flourishing, could make some improvements seems a little presumptuous, but I've talked with the pastor about that, and I think that's something that we all have to constantly wonder about.
John, why don't you mention something about Steve Seek's book in regard to the music and what you learned from him?
A voice professor at the Conservatory, Lawrence, has been the music director at the UU in Appleton. He recently received a call to be a pastor or a minister in the UU. He's pursuing that. He's quitting his job at Lawrence. He's quitting the music directorship there and is going to become a minister. We've talked to him, suggesting that maybe Manitowoc might be a good place to live. He's a wonderful man, but he wrote a book on pedagogy and shared a story about what he learned as a music teacher, because there was a student who refused to sing a particular song. And he realized that the student, to her credit, came in and talked to him about it. And he learned that the ideas in these songs that are often sung by high school choirs or choruses reflect European religious tradition, and things that don't necessarily reference those things specifically. And she had a problem with it. And he came to understand that he needed to respect that and find a new way to choose the music that was taught. And he wrote a book for music teachers, which I bought and read and passed on to a music teacher who happens to be Ginny's grandson-in-law, sort of. Yeah. So
I'd like to make a comment. Back in the 70s in Milwaukee, I had been a 2-year RN and I was getting a baccalaureate degree. And while I was doing that, the instructor that had a class of RNs doing what I was doing, her husband was the minister in Grafton, a UU minister. And she told us
that she really encouraged all of us to take a course that the Unitarians had developed. Now, I don't know if it was local Unitarians or how a wider group of Unitarians, I'm not sure, but it was on, basically the topic that you're talking about today. And it was also called human sexuality, which you made a differentiation today, which I certainly appreciate. But a lot of the beginnings of the education came from the UUs.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I think we should point out that the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship singing group has made an effort to include some Native American music in your selections, and that's appreciative. And perhaps we can go a little farther, and Bev wants to respond to that, I think, and then we have another question over here. Go ahead.
Our hymn books do have quite a variety of African-American spirituals and others, but they are probably dominated by the European tradition, like
Right.
John said.
The hymn book makes an effort, that's true. Was there another comment over here?
So I was reminded of two celebrity interviews while I was listening to you. The first was early in Lady Gaga's career. There was someone thought they were starting a nasty rumor by saying that she was intersex. And so an interviewer said something, he was trying to get the headline, and he said, some people are saying you have a penis. What's your response to that? And she says, maybe I do. I don't care, and neither do my fans. Which I really appreciated. That she didn't answer it. She was, maybe I do, who cares? And then Johnny Galecki, who was David on Roseanne, and then more recently he was on The Big Bang Theory. His sexuality was in question and he never addressed it. And so another interviewer, said, would you talk about your sexuality? There's rumors that you're gay. And he said, maybe I am. Who cares? Why should it matter? And I really appreciated the fact that, he said, why defend something that's not offensive? And I really appreciated those two interview answers, because that is driving home that one day this should be a non-issue. Who really cares? How does it affect you? So
Thank you.
On National Coming Out Day, 4 years ago, I was standing at the intersection, a busy intersection in Appleton, with a friend who is now renting my house in Appleton. And I was carrying a sign that said, "Thank God for gay sex, all that fun and no abortions." And I realized partway through that people could very well figure that I was gay. And I thought to myself, yeah, and if they do, I felt a sense of gratitude that that's how I felt. That, maybe I am, but I'm not sure that that's a matter that concerns anyone.
And right now, we're going a little bit over, so let's take one more comment.
I have a question. It's relatively, I'm in the generation to where this is the pronoun indication would be a new process for me to learn. How should I do that? Do I put my name in she, or do I introduce myself as Scotty Peterson, she? I'm not sure how you do it.
A model. Actually, we talked about this, and I convinced her that we could try both, because I didn't know how much it would cost to get this badge redone. So I had mine done, and then I had to put this little tag on it.
What does it say?
It says he, him, his.
So you use all three?
Yeah.
I'm just asking for the procedural.
Yeah.
And
when
what we learned is that it's not much difference in price between having this put on and having a new badge.
How do you introduce yourself?
How do I?
Yeah.
I have to say that it depends on the group. Like here, I probably wouldn't say my pronouns because I know everyone here, and it's not normative here. My hope is that it becomes the kind of thing where someone stands up and says, "Hi, I'm John Fease, my pronouns are he, him."
And that's often done. I'm going to interrupt and say that I asked John's friend Vered that a question like that. I said, what do you say to somebody in a group who comes in, everybody else knows everybody? Do you ask what pronouns they use? And he said, just what John said, it kind of depends on the group, and sometimes you discreetly ask if you think it's appropriate. But I think right now, wearing name tags that have your pronoun, introducing yourself that way when it feels appropriate to you, when it feels right to you, I think that's where we start.
And
Because
at 75, I have to learn to make that a habit.
Me too.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't just. It
But
just doesn't
like
just
I
happen.
said, I needed to know what's the procedure to make it normative, that everybody identifies their pronouns, so it's not a big deal.
And I think it's important, just one thing we can do is not object to that. I mean, if somebody asks, you readily say what your pronouns are, and you get used to saying she, her, hers. And I would just want to clarify, I had my name tag done this way because my name tag said Virginia, and I never called myself Virginia, so I wanted to change it to Ginny anyway. And I found out, so this is how we found out that it fits very easily underneath your name, if you want to have it redone. We went to the place that created our name tags in the first place, and they charged us very little for me to have a new one and for John to have that little addition on his. Sure, you can just go there and take your name tag with
Kathy
you.
has the name of, I can't think of the name.
What's the name of it? The
Manitowoc Trophy.
Yeah,
Manitowoc
it's right
Trophy.
on, is that on?
Washington Street, I think.
Yeah.
Right where Washington, or Calumet becomes Washington, I think it is. And they've done it, and so they'll know what you're talking about. And we're going to have to close now, I think it will, but everybody please stay for